Officer Jacob Davis sat in his patrol car, the low hum of the engine vibrating through the seat, his fingers drumming impatiently on the steering wheel. The shift had been dull, just like every other night in this quiet corner of town. No real action, no excitement, just the usual rounds in a neighborhood he had long since written off as a lost cause. He sighed heavily, glancing at the dimly lit streets lined with crumbling buildings and shuttered storefronts. He didn't want to be here, never did. In his mind, this was the kind of place that bred trouble. Run down, full of people who didn't seem to care about improving their lives, always blaming others for their problems. His breath hissed through his teeth as he glanced at the clock on his dashboard. Another 3 hours to go before his shift was over, and there was nothing to break the monotony. As he cruised past a closed corner store, a figure caught his eye. A woman stood just outside the door, hunched over slightly, holding a plastic grocery bag in one hand and a cane in the other. She was wearing an oversized coat that swallowed her small frame, and a wide-brimmed hat that cast her face in shadow. To Davis, she looked out of place. Too old to be out this late, too suspicious to be standing there for no reason. What's she doing here at this hour? Davis muttered to himself, narrowing his eyes. Something about her unsettled him. He had long ago developed a sense for trouble, or at least what he thought was trouble, and this woman fit the profile. Loitering, probably homeless, or worse, maybe involved in something illegal. It didn't matter that she looked frail. He knew from experience that appearances could be deceiving. Davis pulled the squad car to a stop across the street, his gaze fixed on her. Watching. She wasn't doing anything, just standing there, occasionally shifting her weight from one leg to the other, but that was enough in Davis's mind. She didn't need to be doing anything to warrant his suspicion. Her mere presence in the middle of the night in this neighborhood was reason enough. He exhaled through his nose, tightening his grip on the steering wheel. His pulse quickened not from fear, but from the anticipation of asserting his authority. He liked these moments, the feeling of power that came with being able to command respect, or at least force it. And this woman, standing there as if she had all the time in the world, was about to be reminded of who was in charge. He put the car in park and swung the door open, the sound of his boots hitting the pavement punctuating the stillness of the night. As he crossed the street, he noticed the way the woman barely reacted to his approach. She wasn't nervous, wasn't fidgeting like most people did when they saw a cop walking toward them. It irritated him. "Hey," Davis called out, his voice cutting through the quiet. The woman turned her head slowly, her eyes barely visible beneath the brim of her hat. She didn't speak, didn't flinch, and that only fueled his irritation further. He closed the distance between them in a few strides, coming to stand just a couple of feet in front of her. Up close, she looked even older than he had first thought. Her skin wrinkled, her hands thin and bony. Her clothes looked secondhand, the kind of worn-out stuff that told him she didn't have much. "What are you doing here?" Davis demanded, his voice sharp, authoritative. He expected an answer right away, but the woman simply blinked at him, her expression calm, almost serene. She didn't seem intimidated, and that set Davis on edge. "I asked you a question," he said, stepping closer, his posture straightening as he tried to impose his presence on her. "You got ID?" The woman remained silent for a moment, her eyes studying him in a way that made him uncomfortable. Then finally she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. I'm just on my way home." Davis scoffed, his lips curling into a sneer. "Home? It's after midnight. You shouldn't be out here loitering like this. What's in the bag?" The woman glanced down at the plastic bag she held loosely in her hand. "Just some groceries," she said evenly, lifting it slightly as if to show there was nothing suspicious inside. Davis didn't care. Her calmness, her refusal to be rattled, was getting under his skin. He had dealt with all kinds of people in his career, most of them knew better than to argue with a cop, especially in this part of town. But this woman, she wasn't playing by the rules. She wasn't scared, and that made him want to push harder. "Show me what's inside," he ordered, his voice dropping lower, more menacing now. The woman sighed, a tired expression crossing her face, but she didn't argue. She slowly lifted the bag, showing him a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, and some canned goods. Nothing out of the ordinary. But Davis wasn't satisfied. He had expected more: drugs, stolen items, anything that would justify the suspicion bubbling in his chest. Finding nothing only made him more agitated. "That's all you're carrying?" he asked, his voice dripping with disbelief. The woman nodded, saying nothing further. Davis could feel his control over the situation slipping away, and it infuriated him. He needed to assert dominance, to remind her and himself who was in charge. His mind raced, searching for something, anything, to escalate the situation. "Let me see your ID," he demanded again, more forcefully this time. The woman's expression didn't change. She slowly reached into her coat, her movements deliberate, cautious. She pulled out a worn wallet and handed him her ID without a word. Davis snatched it from her hand, glancing at the name and address: Margaret Hill. A local address. Nothing suspicious, but that didn't matter to him. He could feel the control of the situation slipping, and it gnawed at his ego. He handed the ID back to her with a sharp flick of his wrist, his eyes narrowing. "Why are you out here, really?" he asked, leaning closer, his voice dropping into a near growl. "I don't buy your story. What's the real reason you're hanging around this neighborhood at this hour?" Margaret looked him straight in the eye, unflinching. "I told you the truth, officer. I'm just trying to get home. There's no need to treat me like a criminal." The calmness in her voice, the steady gaze, it was too much. Davis's face flushed with anger. How dare she act as though she wasn't intimidated by him? How dare she challenge his authority? Even with her polite words and soft tone, she was defying him. He wasn't about to let her walk away unscathed. Not after this encounter. "Lady," he spat, stepping closer so that they were almost chest to chest. "You don't tell me what I need to do. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I'm going to make sure you understand that." The tension in the air was thick now, the silence of the street amplifying the exchange between them. Davis's heart pounded in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. This woman, this old, fragile-looking woman, had somehow gotten under his skin, and he wasn't sure why. All he knew was that he needed to regain control. He needed to assert his authority before this situation slipped entirely out of his hands. The air felt heavier as Officer Jacob Davis stood towering over Margaret Hill, his chest rising and falling in shallow, frustrated breaths. He couldn't understand it, how this elderly woman, so small and seemingly frail, could remain so composed in the face of his authority. He was used to people quaking at the sight of his uniform, especially in this neighborhood. But she wasn't like the others, and that unnerved him. The street around them remained eerily quiet, the occasional distant sound of a car engine or a muffled conversation drifting through the air. A few pedestrians had passed by, quickening their pace when they saw the confrontation, afraid to be caught in the middle of whatever was about to unfold. The yellow light from the street lamps cast long, warped shadows over the cracked pavement, giving the scene an unsettling feeling, as though it were taking place in some distorted dream. Davis was seething. Every second that Margaret stood there, calm and steady, was another blow to his ego. He could feel his patience wearing thin, his control slipping through his fingers like water. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers itching to make some kind of move, something that would force her to react the way he expected, fearful, obedient, submissive. But she just stood there, her cane held loosely in one hand, her eyes locked onto his with an expression that he couldn't read. It wasn't defiance, exactly, but it wasn't fear either. It was confidence. That's what made it worse. She was confident, even in the face of his authority, and that was a problem. "You're not from around here, are you?" Davis spat, taking another step closer, his face inches from hers now, his breath hot, laced with the coffee he had been drinking all night to keep himself awake. Margaret didn't flinch. "I've lived in this neighborhood longer than you've been an officer," she replied evenly, her voice still calm, her expression unchanged. "And I've seen plenty of officers like you come and go." Her words hit him like a slap in the face. The accusation, the dismissal, the implication that he was no different from all the other cops who had patrolled these streets and left without making any real change. It stung. And it enraged him. "Listen here, lady," he growled, grabbing her arm before he even realized what he was doing. The force of his grip caused her to stumble slightly, but she didn't cry out, didn't react the way he had expected. Instead, she looked down at his hand on her arm, and then back up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You need to let go of me," she said softly, her voice taking on a harder edge now. Davis's pulse was pounding in his ears, drowning out the sound of the night around him. He wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He was too angry, too caught up in the need to regain control. He tightened his grip on her arm, pulling her closer. "I'll let go when I'm damn well ready," he snarled. For a moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. The street was empty, save for the two of them. The lights from the street lamps flickered slightly, casting a strange, almost dreamlike glow over the scene. Then, in one smooth motion, Margaret reached into her coat. Davis's heart jumped, his mind immediately flashing to the worst possibilities. Was she armed? Was this about to escalate into something much worse than he had anticipated? But what Margaret pulled from her coat wasn't a weapon. It was a badge. An FBI badge. Davis froze, his hands still gripping her arm, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. His heart raced as his eyes flicked from the badge to her face and back again. This couldn't be real. He couldn't have just grabbed an FBI agent like that. He couldn't have made that mistake. But the badge was real, and Margaret's expression told him she wasn't bluffing. "You've made a big mistake, Officer Davis," she said quietly, her voice cold now, all traces of the calm, elderly woman from before gone. In its place was the steely, authoritative tone of someone who had been in control the entire time, someone who had seen the situation coming from the moment he had stepped out of his patrol car. Davis's grip on her arm loosened, and he took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. His mind raced, trying to find some way out of this, some explanation, some excuse. But there was none. The distant wail of sirens reached his ears, growing louder by the second. Backup was coming, and not for him. Margaret didn't move. She just stood there, holding her badge in one hand, her cane in the other, watching him with a look of quiet satisfaction. She didn't say another word. The sirens grew louder, and as Davis stood there, frozen in place, he realized with a sinking feeling that his career, his authority, everything he thought he had control over, was about to come crashing down around him. The badge that had once given him control now felt like a heavy chain around his neck. Margaret's calm gaze pierced through him, her silence saying more than words ever could. In that moment, Davis realized the weight of his actions, not just tonight but over the years. The system he thought had his back had turned on him, and there was no escaping the consequences. What began as a routine night had become the unraveling of a man who had forgotten the very essence of his duty, to protect and serve. But Margaret's unexpected move left a deeper impact than the fall of one officer. As Davis was led away, she softly said, "It's never too late to change." Those words echoed in his mind, planting a seed of reflection. Margaret's strength wasn't just in exposing corruption. It was in teaching that power comes with responsibility, that the true measure of a person lies in how they choose to wield it. For Davis, the night became a turning point, a painful reminder that redemption, though hard-earned, is possible. For others watching, the lesson was clear. Justice doesn't just come from badges or uniforms. It comes from integrity and the courage to stand up for what's right, no matter the cost. In the end, the story of Officer Davis became one of caution and hope. It reminded us that anyone can lose their way, but it's never too late to find the path back. It inspired others to reflect on their own lives, urging them to live with accountability, compassion, and the wisdom to know that power, when used for good, is what truly defines greatness.